The fluorescent lights in the courthouse hallway flickered like dying fireflies, casting harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor. I sat alone on the cold metal bench, my walker positioned beside me like a faithful companion, watching the second hand on the wall clock tick past 2:47 p.m. My hearing had been scheduled for 2:30. 17 minutes late, and still no sign of Marcus, my daughter's husband who had promised to drive me home after what would be one of the most important appointments of my life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The disability determination hearing I'd just endured had left me drained, both physically and emotionally. 3 years of fighting, 3 years of doctor's appointments, medical records, and bureaucratic maze running, all leading to this moment when a stern-faced judge would decide whether Patricia Trish Clark deserved the disability benefits that meant the difference between keeping a roof over my head or becoming another statistic. At 68, with rheumatoid arthritis that had twisted my hands into gnarled branches and a spine that felt like it was held together with rusty screws, I had never imagined I'd be sitting in a government building begging for help to survive. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very son-in-law who had spent the last 6 months rolling his eyes every time I mentioned my aches and pains was supposed to be my ride home from proving those pains were real enough to qualify for assistance. Marcus had made it clear from the beginning that he thought I was exaggerating, that I was just looking for a handout, that people my age should have planned better for retirement. What he didn't know, what nobody knew except my late husband, Robert, and our old attorney, was that I had planned perfectly well. The secrets I carried would have made Marcus's smug expression crumble faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. My name is Patricia Clark, though everyone who mattered called me Trish. For 43 years, I was Mrs. Robert Clark, wife to a man who built houses with his hands and dreams with his heart. We lived in Millbrook, a small town in Ohio where everybody knew everybody, and where a handshake still meant something. Our little white house on Maple Street had a front porch swing that Robert installed the week after we moved in, back in 1979, when my hair was still auburn and my joints moved like they were oiled. I had been a teacher then, kindergarten through 2nd grade at Millbrook Elementary. 26 years of tying shoelaces, wiping noses, and watching little minds discover that letters could become words, and words could become stories. The children called me Mrs. Clark in their sweet, uncertain voices, but I called each of them by name and remembered their birthdays long after they'd grown tall enough to see over my desk. Teaching wasn't just what I did, it was who I was, until arthritis came creeping through my fingers like winter frost, making it impossible to hold a pencil steady or bend down to help a child with their reading. Robert understood. He always understood. When I had to retire early at 54, he simply held me while I cried into his flannel shirt that smelled of sawdust and Old Spice. "We'll figure it out, Trish," he'd whispered into my hair. "We always do." And we did figure it out, because Robert Clark was the kind of man who could build more than houses. He could build hope. Our daughter Emily was 22 then, fresh out of college with a degree in marketing and stars in her eyes about conquering the corporate world. She was beautiful in the way that turns heads, with Robert's deep brown eyes and my stubborn chin, but she was also restless in the way that made me worry she'd never find contentment anywhere. Emily had inherited my determination, but none of my patience, Robert's ambition, but not his wisdom about what truly mattered. The early retirement years were some of our happiest. Robert's construction business, Clark & Sons Building, had grown from a one-man operation with a rusty pickup truck to a respected company with 12 employees and more work than they could handle. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. We took weekend trips to Amish country, hosted neighborhood barbecues, and spent quiet evenings on that front porch swing watching the world slow down around us. Robert was my anchor, my safe harbor, in every storm. When the arthritis flares left me bedridden for days, he'd bring me tea with honey and read mystery novels aloud in his gravelly voice that could make even the phone book sound interesting. When I felt useless, like I was just taking up space in a world that valued productivity above all else, he'd remind me that I'd shaped hundreds of young minds, and that was worth more than any paycheck. Then Emily met Marcus Fitzgerald, arrived in Millbrook like a sleek sports car in a town full of pickup trucks, all flash and noise and promises of something bigger than what we small-town folks could imagine. He worked in commercial real estate development, which he explained to anyone who'd listen meant he found ways to turn empty land into profitable projects. He wore suits that cost more than most people in Millbrook made in a month and spoke in corporate buzzwords that made simple concepts sound revolutionary. Emily was 28 when she brought him home for the first time, practically vibrating with excitement as she introduced the man she was totally crazy about. Marcus was handsome in a magazine-perfect way, with silver threading through, his dark hair that made him look distinguished rather than old, and he had the kind of smile that politicians spent years perfecting. He shook Robert's hand with just the right amount of firmness and complimented my pot roast with just the right amount of enthusiasm. But something about him made me uneasy in a way I couldn't name. Robert, ever the peacemaker, gave Marcus the benefit of the doubt. "He makes Emily happy," he'd say when I voiced my concerns. "That's what matters." But I watched the way Marcus's eyes wandered around our modest home, cataloging and calculating, and I saw how he'd check his phone every few minutes like he was afraid he was missing something more important somewhere else. This wasn't a man who was content with small-town life, and I worried about what that would mean for Emily. They married 2 years later in a ceremony that cost more than Robert and I had spent on our entire first year of marriage. It was held at some fancy resort 3 hours away, the kind of place where they charged you for breathing their rarefied air. Emily wore a dress that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale, and Marcus looked every inch the successful businessman, in his custom tuxedo. The wedding photos were stunning, all soft lighting and perfect poses, but I remember thinking they looked more like actors playing the roles of bride and groom than two people who couldn't wait to start a life together. After the wedding, Emily and Marcus settled in Columbus, where Marcus's company was based. Emily got a job at a marketing firm and seemed to throw herself into becoming the kind of urban sophisticate she'd always dreamed of being. They lived in a sleek downtown condo with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a home where people actually lived. Robert and I visited a few times, but the visits always felt forced, like we were tourists in our own daughter's life. Marcus would give us tours of the condo, pointing out the expensive appliances and designer fixtures like we were potential buyers rather than family. Emily would take us to trendy restaurants where the portions were tiny and the prices were astronomical, places where I felt like everyone was speaking a language I'd never learned. "This isn't Em anymore," I'd whisper to Robert during the long drives home to Millbrook. "It's like she's trying to become someone else." "People change, Trish," he'd reply, but I could hear the sadness in his voice. Maybe this is who she was always meant to be. I wanted to believe him, wanted to think that our daughter was simply growing into herself rather than growing away from us. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus was slowly erasing the Emily we'd raised, replacing her with some polished version that would fit better into his ambitious world. The visits became less frequent as the years passed. Emily and Marcus were always busy with work, with travel, with their social obligations in the city. They'd send birthday cards with generic messages and Christmas gifts that felt like they'd been chosen by a personal shopper who'd never met us. When we called, Emily's voice would be bright and cheerful, but distant, like she was speaking to us from another planet rather than just another state. Robert never complained, but I could see how it wore on him. He'd built Emily a dollhouse when she was 7, spending weeks in his workshop crafting tiny furniture and painting miniature rooms with the same care he put into building real houses. It still sat on a shelf in what used to be her bedroom, gathering dust while our daughter lived in a glass tower that might as well have been on the moon. The arthritis continued its slow march through my body, claiming new territory each year. What started in my hands spread to my knees, my shoulders, my spine. Some mornings I'd wake up feeling like I'd been hit by a truck, my joints swollen and screaming in protest at the mere thought of movement. The medications helped, but they came with their own price tag, both financial and physical. The side effects made me nauseous, dizzy, and constantly tired. Robert became my hands when mine wouldn't work, my legs when mine wouldn't carry me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He learned to braid my hair when my fingers couldn't manage it, to help me button my clothes when the simple task became impossible. He never made me feel like a burden, never sighed with impatience or frustration, never made me feel like I was anything less than the woman he'd fallen in love with all those years ago. For better or worse, in sickness and in health, he'd say when I'd apologize for needing so much help. Those weren't just pretty words, Trish. They were promises, and I keep my promises. By the time I turned 65, walking had become a daily negotiation between my body and my will. Some days my will won, and I could make it to the mailbox, or water the flowers on the front porch. Other days, my body called the shots, and I'd spend hours in bed or in Robert's old recliner, wrapped in heating pads and praying for the pain to ease. Robert suggested I apply for disability benefits, but I resisted. In my mind, disability was for people who were really sick, people who had serious diseases or traumatic injuries. I was just getting old, just dealing with the normal aches and pains that came with aging. I didn't want to be another person taking handouts from the government when there were surely others who needed help more than I did. Trish, honey, Robert would say gently, you paid into this system for 26 years. You're not taking a handout. You're claiming what you've already earned. There's no shame in needing help. But there was shame, at least for me. Shame in admitting that my body had betrayed me. Shame in acknowledging that the strong, capable woman who had once managed a classroom full of energetic children was now struggling to open a jar of pickles. Shame in being seen as weak, as dependent, as less than I used to be. The decision was ultimately made for me on a rainy Tuesday in October. I'd been trying to get down the front porch steps to bring in the mail when my left knee simply gave out. I fell hard, my walker clattering away from me as I hit the concrete steps. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, shooting through my entire body like lightning. I lay there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, unable to get up, unable to call for help, watching the rain soak through my sweater and wondering if this was how it would end. Robert found me when he came home from the hardware store. I'll never forget the look on his face, the way the color drained from his cheeks as he knelt beside me on the wet concrete. "Oh, Trish," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Oh, honey, what happened?" The fall resulted in a fractured wrist and bruised ribs, but more importantly, it forced us both to face reality. I couldn't keep pretending that I was fine, that I could manage on my own, that my condition wasn't serious enough to warrant help. Robert insisted on starting the disability application process that very week, and I was too tired and too sore to argue. Emily called when she heard about the fall, her voice tight with what I chose to interpret as concern rather than annoyance. "Mom, why didn't you tell us it was getting this bad?" she asked, and I could hear Marcus in the background asking her to hurry up because they had dinner reservations. "I didn't want to worry you," I said, which was partly true. The other part, the part I didn't say, was that I hadn't been sure she'd care enough to worry. "Well, you need to be more careful," Emily said. "Maybe it's time to think about assisted living or something. Marcus says there are some really nice places that specialize in senior care." Marcus says. Those two words had become Emily's favorite way to start sentences, as if her husband's opinions carried more weight than her own thoughts or feelings. I wondered when our independent, strong-willed daughter had started needing a man to tell her what to think about her own mother's well-being. "I'm not ready for that yet," I said firmly. "Your father and I are managing just fine." But we weren't managing just fine. and we both knew it. Robert was 69 and dealing with his own age-related aches and pains, though he'd never admit it. Taking care of me was wearing him down, though he'd die before he'd say so. I could see it in the way he moved a little slower in the mornings, in the new lines around his eyes, in the careful way he helped me up from chairs as if he was afraid his own back might give out. The disability application process was a nightmare of bureaucracy and medical documentation. Forms that asked the same questions in different ways. Doctor's appointments where I had to perform my pain for strangers who looked at me with skeptical eyes, as if they thought I was auditioning for a role I didn't deserve. The system seemed designed to make people give up, to wear them down until they decided it wasn't worth the fight. Robert fought alongside me every step of the way. He organized my medical records, drove me to appointments, sat in waiting rooms that smelled of disinfectant and desperation. He helped me fill out forms when my hands were too stiff to hold a pen, and he held me when the rejections came, because of course, there were rejections. The first application was denied because I didn't meet their criteria for severity. The first appeal was denied because my condition was deemed manageable with proper treatment. It seemed like no matter how much evidence we provided, it was never enough. Emily and Marcus visited twice during this period, both times for major holidays when their absence would have been too obvious to ignore. The visits were stilted affairs, full of polite conversation and careful topics. Marcus would ask about Robert's business with the kind of interest that felt manufactured, and Emily would compliment my cooking while barely touching her food. They'd sleep in Emily's old room and leave the morning after the holiday, always citing work obligations or prior commitments. During their last visit, Marcus made an offhand comment that revealed more about his character than he probably intended. We'd been sitting on the front porch after Christmas dinner, watching the snow fall in fat, lazy flakes, when the conversation turned to my ongoing disability case. "I just don't understand why it's taking so long," Emily said, her voice carrying a note of frustration that I wasn't sure was directed at the system or at me. "How hard can it be to prove that someone needs help?" Marcus leaned back in Robert's chair, the one that had been perfectly molded to my husband's body over the years, and shrugged. "The system's designed to weed out the fakers," he said casually. "Too many people trying to game the system, looking for easy money instead of finding ways to contribute. I'm sure Mom's case is legitimate, but you can't blame the government for being careful." The words hit me like a physical blow. Mom's case. As if my pain, my struggle, my daily battle with a body that had betrayed me was just a case to be evaluated. And the implication that I might be a faker, someone looking for easy money, made my cheeks burn with shame and anger. Robert's jaw tightened, and I could see him struggling to keep his temper in check. "Trish worked for 26 years. He said quietly. "She paid into the system, and now she's asking for what she's owed. There's nothing easy about what she's going through." Marcus held up his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "Hey, I'm not saying she's faking it. I'm just explaining why the process takes so long. The government has to be thorough." But I'd heard what he really meant. I'd heard the skepticism in his voice, the suggestion that maybe I wasn't trying hard enough to overcome my limitations, that maybe I was taking the easy way out instead of finding ways to push through the pain. It was the same attitude I'd encountered from some of the doctors, from some of the government officials, from a society that seemed to believe that anyone who couldn't bootstrap their way through disability was somehow lacking in character. That night, as I lay in bed listening to Robert's steady breathing beside me, I made a decision. I wouldn't give up on the disability case because I needed those benefits to survive. But I also wouldn't let Marcus's judgment define me. I had nothing to prove to him, nothing to justify to a man who'd never spent a single day wondering if he'd be able to get out of bed without crying from pain. What Marcus didn't know, what I'd never told Emily or anyone else except Robert, was that we weren't as helpless as we appeared. Robert's construction business had done better over the years than we'd let on, and we'd made some smart investments with the help of an old friend who worked in financial planning. We owned not just our house on Maple Street, but also the small apartment building where Emily and Marcus currently lived in Columbus. We'd bought it years ago as an investment property, back when Emily was still in college, and Marcus was just a name she mentioned occasionally. The building had 6 units, all of them occupied by young professionals who paid their rent on time and took care of the property. Emily and Marcus lived in the nicest unit, the corner apartment with the big windows and the updated kitchen, and they paid significantly below market rate because Robert had always believed in taking care of family. They thought they were getting a deal from some absentee landlord named R&T Property Management, never realizing that R&T stood for Robert and Trish. Robert had handled all the property management details, collecting rent through a management company and keeping our ownership quiet. "Let's keep it simple," he'd said when we first bought the building. "No need to complicate family relationships with business." At the time, I'd thought he was just being his usual humble self, but now I wondered if he'd had a premonition about how complicated those family relationships would become. The secret sat in my chest like a small, warm coal. Every time Marcus made a snide comment about people who didn't contribute, every time he implied that I was looking for handouts, I thought about the checks he wrote each month for rent on an apartment we owned. I thought about how quickly his attitude might change if he knew that the easy money he was so concerned about could disappear with a single conversation. But I kept the secret, because that's what Robert wanted, and because some part of me still hoped that Emily would remember who she used to be before Marcus convinced her that success was measured only in dollar signs and status symbols. I kept the secret because I wasn't ready to use it as a weapon, wasn't ready to become the kind of person who held financial leverage over her own family. That restraint would be tested in ways I couldn't imagine in the months to come, as my disability case dragged on and my relationship with Marcus deteriorated from polite tolerance to open hostility. The courthouse hearing was supposed to be the end of a long, difficult journey, the moment when I'd finally get the recognition and support I needed to live with dignity despite my limitations. Instead, it became the beginning of a reckoning. That would change everything. A day when the careful balance I'd maintained between pride and necessity, between family loyalty and self-preservation, would finally tip toward something I'd never expected to become. A woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Robert died on a Wednesday morning in March, 3 months before my disability hearing was finally scheduled. He went peacefully, in his sleep, the way people always say they hope to go. But peaceful deaths don't make the grief any less devastating for those left behind. I woke up that morning to find him still and cold beside me, his face relaxed in a way it hadn't been in months. The man who had been my strength, my advocate, my fiercest defender was gone, leaving me to face the final phase of my disability case alone. The funeral was a testament to the kind of man Robert had been. Half of Millbrook showed up, including former employees, neighbors, and parents of children I'd taught decades earlier. The church overflowed with people whose lives Robert had touched, through his work, his kindness, his quiet generosity. Emily and Marcus flew in from Columbus, both dressed in appropriately somber black, and for a brief moment I thought maybe grief would strip away the pretenses and bring us back together as a family. I was wrong. During the viewing, I overheard Marcus on his phone in the church lobby, his voice carrying that familiar tone of irritated efficiency. I know, but it's a family emergency. The old man finally kicked the bucket, so we're stuck here for a few days dealing with funeral arrangements and estate nonsense. Estate nonsense. As if Robert's life, his legacy, his careful planning for my future was nothing more than paperwork to be processed and filed away. Emily stood beside Robert's casket for a long time, her perfectly manicured hand resting on the polished wood. I watched her face, hoping to see some glimpse of the little girl who used to curl up in Robert's lap while he read her bedtime stories, but her expression remained composed, controlled, empty. When she finally approached me, her hug felt like a choreographed gesture, brief and perfunctory. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mom," she said, the words formal and distant, as if she were offering condolences to a stranger rather than grieving alongside me. Dad was a good man. Was, past tense, as if Robert's goodness had ended with his breathing rather than continuing to ripple outward through all the lives he'd touched. I wanted to shake her, to make her understand that we hadn't just lost a good man, we'd lost the gravitational center that had held our family together. Without Robert's patient diplomacy, his gentle wisdom, his ability to see the best in everyone, what did we have left? The answer became clear in the weeks following the funeral. Marcus's mask of sympathy slipped away so quickly I wondered if I'd imagined it in the first place. Emily called occasionally, but the conversations were stilted and brief, focused on practical matters rather than emotional support. She asked about insurance policies and estate details with the detached interest of someone handling a business transaction rather than the settling of her father's affairs. "Marcus thinks you should consider selling the house," she said during one particularly painful phone call. "The upkeep is going to be expensive, and with your mobility issues, it doesn't make sense to stay in a place with stairs and a big yard to maintain. Marcus thinks." There were those two words again, the preface to every opinion Emily expressed these days. I wondered when she'd stopped having thoughts of her own, when she'd started requiring her husband's permission to form opinions about her own mother's life. "This is my home, Emily," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Your father and I built a life here. I'm not ready to give that up." "But Mom, be practical. You can't keep living in denial about your limitations. Marcus says there are some really nice senior communities that specialize in your kind of health issues. Places where you'd have support and medical care on site. Your kind of health issues. As if arthritis were some exotic disease rather than a common condition that millions of people managed to live with in their own homes." I realized then that Emily had fully absorbed Marcus's view of me as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be supported. The disability hearing had been postponed twice due to Robert's death and the subsequent legal complications of settling his estate. The third date was set for June 15th, and as it approached, I felt increasingly anxious about facing the process alone. Robert had been my emotional support through every step of the application process, and the thought of sitting in that sterile government building without him made my chest tight with panic. That's when Marcus surprised me by offering to drive me to the hearing. "Emily's got that big presentation at work," he explained when he called, his tone suggesting this was a significant inconvenience, but one he was willing to endure. "She can't take the time off, but I can shuffle some meetings around. The courthouse is only 20 minutes from our office anyway." I should have been grateful. I should have seen it as a sign that maybe Marcus was capable of kindness after all, that maybe he understood how difficult this would be for me. Instead, something in his voice made me uneasy. A note of calculation that suggested his offer wasn't entirely altruistic. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said carefully. "But I can take a taxi. You don't need to disrupt your work schedule." "Nonsense," Marcus replied, and I could practically hear him waving away my concerns. "We're family. Besides, I'm curious about this whole disability thing. I've never seen the process in action. Curious about this whole disability thing. Not concerned about my well-being, not invested in my success, just curious like someone who might watch a documentary about an unfamiliar culture." But I needed the ride, and beggars couldn't be choosers, so I accepted his offer with as much grace as I could muster. The morning of the hearing, Marcus arrived at my house in his sleek silver sedan, the same car he'd driven to Robert's funeral. He was dressed for the office in an expensive suit and silk tie, checking his phone as I slowly made my way down the front porch steps with my walker. He didn't get out to help me, didn't open the car door, just watched through the windshield as I struggled to fold my walker and get myself situated in the passenger seat. "All set?" he asked once I was buckled in, already backing out of the driveway before I could answer. The drive to Columbus was filled with Marcus's phone calls conducted through his car's Bluetooth system, conversations about property deals and profit margins that made it clear I was just a minor inconvenience in his busy day. The courthouse was an imposing brick building that looked like it had been designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Marcus found a parking spot near the front entrance and checked his watch with visible impatience. "How long is this thing supposed to take?" he asked, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. "The lawyer said probably 2 hours," I replied, already feeling defensive about the time commitment I was requiring from him. Marcus sighed. 2 hours? Well, I guess I can find a coffee shop and get some work done. Text me when you're finished, and I'll come pick you up. Text me. As if I were a teenager being dropped off at the mall, rather than an elderly woman facing a crucial hearing that would determine my financial future. I wanted to tell him that I'd expected him to come inside with me, to provide moral support the way Robert would have done, but the expression on his face made it clear that he considered driving me to be the full extent of his family obligation. The hearing itself was even more brutal than I'd anticipated. The administrative law judge was a tired-looking woman who seemed skeptical of everyone who appeared before her, as if years of hearing sob stories had worn away any capacity for empathy. My lawyer, a young man named David Chen who specialized in disability cases, had prepared me for the kinds of questions I'd face. But nothing could have prepared me for the way they made me feel like a fraud, even though I was telling the absolute truth. "Mrs. Clark, can you describe your typical daily activities?" the judge asked, her pen poised over a legal pad as if she were about to take notes on my failures. I explained how some mornings I couldn't get out of bed without help, how opening jars had become impossible, how walking to the mailbox left me exhausted and in pain. I described the way my hands locked up in the cold, how my knees gave out, without warning, how the medications that were supposed to help made me dizzy and nauseous. "But you're able to dress yourself?" she pressed. "Most days, yes, though it takes much longer than it used to, and some days I need help with buttons and zippers." "And you can prepare simple meals?" "Simple ones, yes. I can't stand for long periods, so nothing complicated." "Can you drive?" "Short distances, on good days, when my hands aren't too stiff to grip the steering wheel properly." Each answer felt like an admission of failure, a public acknowledgement of all the ways my body had betrayed me. The judge's questions were designed to find the gaps between total helplessness and complete independence, as if disability existed only in the narrow space of absolute incapacity. The medical expert, a doctor who had never examined me personally but had reviewed my files, testified that my condition was consistent with normal aging and that with proper medication management and lifestyle modifications, I should be able to perform substantial gainful activity. He spoke about me like I wasn't sitting right there, reducing my daily struggle to clinical terms that stripped away all the human reality of living with chronic pain. My own doctor, Dr. Martinez, had submitted detailed reports documenting the progression of my arthritis, the limitations it imposed, and the prognosis for my condition. But somehow his years of treating me, his first-hand knowledge of my struggles, carried less weight than the opinion of a stranger who had spent 20 minutes reading my medical records. The hearing lasted exactly 2 hours and 17 minutes. When it was over, David Chen walked me to the courthouse lobby, his expression carefully neutral in the way lawyers learn to mask bad news. "How do you think it went?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from his tone. "These cases are always difficult to predict," he said diplomatically. The judge seemed thorough in her questioning. "We should have a decision within 60 days. Thorough. That was lawyer speak for hostile. I thanked David for his representation and watched him hurry away to his next appointment, another disabled person who needed his help navigating a system designed to exhaust them into giving up. I sat on the metal bench in the courthouse lobby and pulled out my phone to text Marcus, my arthritic fingers moving slowly across the small keyboard. "Hearing finished. Ready for pickup. I hit send and waited, watching government employees and lawyers stride past me with purpose while I sat there feeling like debris washed up on an unfamiliar shore. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. I texted again. Still waiting? In courthouse lobby. No response. I tried calling, but the call went straight to voicemail. Hi, you've reached Marcus Fitzgerald. I'm either on another call or away from my phone. Leave a message and I'll get back to you. 45 minutes after the hearing ended, I was still sitting on that cold bench, watching the courthouse empty, out as the afternoon wore on. My back ached from the uncomfortable seating, my walker was starting to feel heavy in my hands, and a familiar panic was beginning to build in my chest. What if Marcus had forgotten about me? What if something had happened to him? What if I was stranded here with no way to get home? An hour passed, then an hour and 15 minutes. The security guard at the front desk started giving me concerned looks, probably wondering why this old woman with a walker was camping out in their lobby. I tried calling Marcus again, but again got his voicemail. This time I left a message, trying to keep my voice steady despite the growing fear in my throat. Marcus, it's Trish. The hearing is over and I'm waiting for you in the courthouse lobby. Could you please call me back and let me know when you'll be here? I'm not sure what to do. Another 30 minutes crawled by. The courthouse was quiet now, most of the daily business concluded, and I was becoming increasingly aware that I was alone in a government building in a city I didn't know well, with no backup plan for getting home. Robert would have been there, waiting for me when I came out of the hearing room. Robert would have held my hand during the testimony, would have looked the judge in the eye and made her see me as a person rather than just another case file. But Robert was gone, and I was learning exactly what that meant in ways I hadn't anticipated. At 2 hours and 15 minutes, just as I was beginning to wonder if I should call a taxi or see if David Chen was still in the building, my phone finally rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and I answered so quickly I nearly dropped the phone. Marcus, where are you? I've been waiting for over 2 hours. Yeah, sorry about that. His voice was casual, distracted, as if he were discussing a minor scheduling mix-up rather than abandoning an elderly woman at a courthouse. I got caught up in a client meeting that ran way over. Big deal we've been working on for months. You know how it is. No, I didn't know how it was. I didn't know how someone could forget about a family member they'd promised to help, could treat a commitment like it was optional, could let business take precedence over basic human decency. I'm still here, I said, trying to keep the hurt and anger out of my voice. In the courthouse lobby, waiting. Right. Listen, I'm actually going to be tied up for a while longer. This client is flying back to New York tonight and we need to hammer out these contract details before he leaves. Why don't you take a taxi home? I'll reimburse you for it. Take a taxi home. A taxi ride from Columbus to Millbrook would cost at least $60, money I couldn't really afford on my fixed income. But more than that, it was the dismissal that hurt, the casual way he was abandoning me after making a commitment to be there. Marcus, I don't understand. You said you'd drive me home after the hearing. I was counting on that. Look, Trish, business is business. This deal could be worth a lot of money and I can't just walk away from it because you need a ride. You're a grown woman. Figure it out. The line went dead. Marcus had hung up on me, left me stranded, dismissed my needs as if they were nothing more than an inconvenience in his important day. I sat there staring at my phone, feeling the weight of my abandonment settle over me like a suffocating blanket. The security guard approached me then, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a concerned expression. Ma'am, are you all right? You've been sitting here for a while. My ride? My son-in-law was supposed to pick me up, but he's been delayed, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I'm trying to figure out how to get home. Where do you live? Millbrook. It's about an hour south of here. The guard whistled, low. That's going to be an expensive taxi ride. Do you have someone else you can call? I looked through my phone contacts, scrolling past Robert's name, which I still couldn't bring myself to delete, past the names of neighbors and old friends, who were all dealing with their own age-related limitations. Who could I call? Who would drop everything on a Wednesday afternoon to drive an hour each way to rescue me from my own family's neglect? I'll figure something out, I said, though I had no idea what that something would be. The guard studied my face and seemed to read the desperation I was trying to hide. Tell you what, he said quietly. My shift ends in 30 minutes. I live out that way, and I wouldn't mind giving you a ride home. Name's Bill Peterson, by the way. I've been working courthouse security for 12 years, and I've seen a lot of folks in tough spots. I wanted to cry at his kindness, this stranger, who was willing to help me when my own family had left me stranded. I couldn't impose like that, I said, though every fiber of my being wanted to accept his offer. It's not an imposition, Bill said firmly. It's what people do for each other. What they should do anyway. What they should do. The words hung in the air between us, a gentle rebuke to Marcus's abandonment and a reminder of the kind of basic human decency that seemed to be in short supply these days. Bill Peterson turned out to be a retired police officer who had taken the courthouse security job to stay busy after his wife passed away. During the drive to Millbrook, he told me stories about his 30 years on the force, about the importance of looking out for people who couldn't look, out for themselves, about the way community used to mean something before everyone got too busy with their own lives to care about their neighbors. Family's supposed to be different, he said as we turned onto Maple Street. Family's supposed to be the people you can count on when everyone else lets you down. I thought so too, I replied, looking at my little white house with its empty driveway and darkened windows. It looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable, like a place where someone lived alone rather than where a family had once thrived. Bill insisted on walking me to the front door, making sure I was safely inside before he left. You take care of yourself, Mrs. Clark, he said, tipping his baseball cap in an old-fashioned gesture of respect. And if you ever need anything, you call the courthouse and ask for Bill. I mean that. After he drove away, I sat in Robert's old recliner and tried to process what had happened. The hearing had been difficult, but expected. The abandonment by Marcus was something else entirely. It was a line crossed, a relationship irreparably damaged, a moment of clarity about exactly where I stood in my daughter's new family structure. The phone rang around 8 o'clock that evening. Emily's name appeared on the caller ID, and I debated whether to answer. Part of me wanted to hear her voice, wanted to believe that she was calling to check on how the hearing had gone, to offer support and encouragement. The other part of me suspected this call would be more of the same thoughtless cruelty I'd experienced from Marcus. Hi, Mom, Emily said when I finally answered. Marcus told me about today. I'm sorry the hearing was so stressful. It was, I said carefully, waiting to see which direction this conversation would go. He said you were upset about the transportation situation. Look, I know it wasn't ideal, but Marcus had a huge client meeting that he couldn't reschedule. You have to understand, this deal he's working on could really advance his career. Sometimes work has to come first. Work has to come first, even before family, even before basic human decency. Even before honoring commitments made to elderly relatives who had no other options. Emily, I said slowly, your father never once put work before family, not once in 43 years of marriage. Dad didn't have the kind of high-pressure career that Marcus has, Emily replied, and I could hear the defensiveness creeping into her voice. Marcus is dealing with million-dollar deals and important clients. It's not the same as building houses in a small town. Not the same as building houses, as if Robert's work had been somehow less valuable because it involved creating homes for families, rather than shuffling money around for wealthy investors. As if the honest labor that had supported our family and employed dozens of people over the years was inferior to Marcus's wheeling and dealing in glass towers. "Your father built something real," I said, my voice shaking with anger I couldn't contain any longer. "He built homes, he built a business, he built a family, he built a life based on keeping his word and treating people with respect. What exactly is Marcus building besides his bank account?" "Mom, that's not fair. Marcus works incredibly hard and he's very successful. He's provided Emily with a good life, a comfortable life. Not everyone can be satisfied with small-town dreams." Provided Emily with a good life, as if Emily were some kind of charity case that Marcus had rescued rather than an accomplished woman who had been perfectly capable of taking care of herself before she met him. When had my daughter started defining herself entirely through her husband's achievements? "I'm not criticizing his success," I said, though that wasn't entirely true. "I'm criticizing his character. A decent person doesn't abandon an elderly relative at a courthouse, Emily. A decent person keeps their commitments, especially to family." "He didn't abandon you. He had a business emergency. There's a difference." "There's no difference when you're the one sitting alone in a government building for over 2 hours, wondering if anyone cares enough to come get you." Silence stretched between us, filled with all the things we weren't saying, all the ways. Our relationship had deteriorated since Marcus entered our lives. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice cold and formal. "I think you're being dramatic, Mom. Marcus did you a favor by offering to drive you in the first place. He didn't owe you anything." "Didn't owe me anything. Her own mother sitting through a disability hearing that would determine my ability to survive financially, and Marcus didn't owe me anything. Not basic courtesy, not common decency, not the simple respect due to another human being, let alone a family member." "You're right," I said quietly. "He doesn't owe me anything. And now we both know exactly where we stand." I hung up the phone and sat in the gathering darkness of my empty house, surrounded by 40 years of memories and feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. Robert was gone. Emily had chosen Marcus's priorities over her own mother's well-being. I was facing an uncertain future with a disability case that might be denied, leaving me without the financial support I needed to maintain my independence. But as I sat there in Robert's chair, something began to shift inside me. The hurt was still there, sharp and fresh, but underneath it was something harder, something that felt almost like relief. For years I'd been making excuses for Marcus's behavior, hoping that Emily would eventually see through his selfishness, believing that family bonds would ultimately prove stronger than his influence over her. Today had stripped away those illusions. Today had shown me exactly who Marcus was and exactly who Emily had chosen to become. And while that knowledge was painful, it was also liberating in a way I hadn't expected. When you know where you stand, when you stop hoping for better treatment and start accepting reality, you can begin to make different choices. I thought about Bill Peterson, the courthouse security guard who had helped a stranger simply because it was the right thing to do. I thought about David Chen, my lawyer, who fought for disabled clients even though the system was stacked against them. I thought about Dr. Martinez, who continued to advocate for my care even when insurance companies and government bureaucrats questioned his professional judgment. There were still good people in the world, people who understood that community, and kindness mattered more than profit margins and career advancement. I just needed to stop expecting that goodness from people who had proven themselves incapable of it. 3 weeks after the hearing, I received the decision letter in my mailbox. My disability claim had been approved. After 3 years of fighting, of documentation, of medical examinations and bureaucratic hurdles, someone had finally acknowledged that my pain was real, my limitations were legitimate, and my need for assistance was justified. I called Emily to share the news, expecting that maybe this victory would bring us back together, that maybe she'd be happy for me or proud of my perseverance. Instead, her response was cool and perfunctory. "That's good, Mom. I'm glad it worked out." A pause then. "Marcus says this should solve your financial problems, so that's a relief," Marcus says. Those two words that had become the soundtrack to every conversation with my daughter. Marcus says this should solve my financial problems, as if my disability benefits were some kind of windfall, rather than a modest monthly payment that would help me afford food and medicine and basic utilities. But I didn't argue. I didn't try to explain how difficult the process had been, or how much Robert's absence had made it harder. I just thanked her for her time and hung up, another small piece of my heart breaking away and floating into the space between who Emily used to be and who she had become. That night, as I sat in my kitchen paying bills with my arthritis gnarled fingers, I made a decision that would change everything. It was time to stop being the victim of other people's selfishness and start using the resources Robert had left me. It was time to remind Marcus Fitzgerald that actions have consequences, and that the elderly woman he'd treated with such casual cruelty wasn't as powerless as he believed. I reached for the phone and dialed a number I'd memorized years ago, but never had reason to use. R&T Property Management, a professional voice answered. "This is Linda speaking. How can I help you?" "Linda, this is Patricia Clark. I need to schedule a meeting about one of our rental properties, the unit where my daughter and son-in-law live. I think it's time for some changes." Linda Martinez had been managing the R&T Property Management portfolio for 7 years, ever since Robert decided he was getting too old to chase down late rent payments and handle maintenance requests himself. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who ran the company with military precision, treating each property like it was her own investment. When I called to schedule a meeting, her voice carried the kind of professional warmth that made tenants feel heard while still maintaining clear boundaries about business expectations. We met at her office the following Tuesday morning, a modest space in a strip mall that belied the substantial portfolio she managed for various property owners throughout Central Ohio. Linda had prepared a comprehensive file on the Riverside Commons apartment building, complete with rental histories, maintenance records, and market analysis reports that made my head spin with their thoroughness. "Mrs. Clark, I have to say your husband was one of my favorite clients," Linda began, settling behind her desk with a steaming cup of coffee. "He always trusted my judgment and never micromanaged the way some owners do. I was so sorry to hear about his passing." "Thank you," I replied, still adjusting to being referred to as the owner rather than Robert's wife. "He spoke very highly of your work. He said you ran the properties like they were your own." "I try to. It's the only way to build long-term value and keep good tenants happy." Linda opened the file and pulled out several documents. "Now, you mentioned on the phone that you wanted to discuss the unit your daughter and son-in-law occupy. Is there something specific you'd like to review?" I had spent 3 sleepless nights thinking about this conversation, weighing my options and trying to separate my hurt feelings from sound business decisions. The last thing I wanted was to become a vindictive landlord who used property ownership as a weapon against family members. But Marcus's behavior at the courthouse had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and I needed to understand exactly what power I held. "I'd like to review their lease terms and rental history," I said carefully, "and I'd like to understand what options are available if I need to make changes to their tenancy." Linda's expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught a flicker of understanding in her eyes. She'd been in property management long enough to recognize family drama when it walked through her door. "Of course. Let me pull up their specific information." She turned to her computer and began typing. "Marcus and Emily Fitzgerald, Unit 4B at Riverside Commons. They've been tenants for 4 years now, and their current lease runs through December 31st of this year." 4 years. They'd been living in my building for 4 years, paying below-market rent to a management company, never knowing that their monthly checks were helping to support the very mother-in-law Marcus had grown to despise. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so painful. "What's their rental history like?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Marcus was too controlling and image-conscious to risk having late payments on his credit report. "Exemplary," Linda confirmed, scrolling through records on her screen. "Never a late payment, no complaints from other tenants, no damage beyond normal wear and tear. From a property management standpoint, they're ideal tenants." Ideal tenants? Who happen to be terrible human beings. It was a distinction that business and family rarely had to navigate simultaneously. "What's the current market rate for their unit?" I asked, steeling myself for the answer. Linda consulted another document. Units comparable to theirs in the building are renting for $1,850 per month. The Fitzgeralds are currently paying $1,200, which was the rate your husband set when they first moved in. He specifically instructed me to keep their rent stable as long as they remained good tenants. $750 below market rate. Every month for 4 years, Robert had been subsidizing their lifestyle to the tune of $9,000 annually. Over the course of their tenancy, we'd given them more than $36,000 in rent savings, money that had helped fund their expensive dinners, their designer clothes, their European vacation the previous fall that Emily had posted, all over social media. "Could their rent be adjusted to market rate?" I asked, my voice steady despite the emotions churning in my chest. "Absolutely. Ohio law allows landlords to raise rent to market rates upon lease renewal, as long as proper notice is given. Since their lease expires in December, we'd need to notify them by October 31st if we plan to adjust their rent for a new lease term." October 31st. That was 5 months away, 5 months during which Marcus would continue to benefit from Robert's generosity while showing nothing but contempt for the family that had made that generosity possible. 5 months during which he'd continue to treat me like a burden while living in my building, parking in my parking space, enjoying the amenities that my investment provided. "What if I decided not to renew their lease at all?" I asked, the words feeling strange and powerful in my mouth. Linda's fingers paused above her keyboard. "That's certainly your right as the property owner. Again, we'd need to provide proper notice by October 31st. The current rental market is quite strong, so we wouldn't have any trouble finding new tenants at market rate." Finding new tenants at market rate. New tenants who would pay $650 more per month than Marcus and Emily currently paid. New tenants who wouldn't roll their eyes at their landlord's generosity or abandon elderly relatives at courthouses. The financial benefits were obvious, but the personal implications made my stomach clench with anxiety. "Is there anything else I should know about their tenancy?" I asked, though I wasn't sure what other revelations I could handle in one morning. Linda hesitated, then pulled out another document. "There is one thing. About 6 months ago, Mr. Fitzgerald contacted our office directly to complain about the building's policies regarding guest parking. Apparently, he felt that as a long-term tenant, he should have priority access to visitor spaces for his business associates." Business associates. Marcus had been using my property to conduct his real estate deals, bringing clients to the building, and expecting special treatment because he considered himself more important than the other tenants. "How was that handled?" I asked, my jaw tightening. I explained that all tenants have equal access to guest parking on a first-come, first-served basis, and that we don't make exceptions based on the nature of someone's work or how long they've lived in the building. He wasn't pleased with that answer. I could imagine Marcus's reaction to being told he couldn't have special privileges. The man who had left me stranded at a courthouse wouldn't respond well to being treated like an ordinary tenant in a building he didn't know he was renting from his wife's mother. "Did he escalate the complaint?" I asked. "He demanded to speak with the property owner directly." I explained that R&T Property Management handles all tenant communications and that the owners prefer to remain uninvolved in day-to-day operations. He said something about knowing important people and suggested that we weren't being responsive to quality tenants like himself. Knowing important people. Marcus had threatened my property management company, had tried to leverage his imagined connections to get special treatment in a building he didn't realize belonged to the very family he'd been insulting. The audacity was breathtaking. "How did you respond to that?" I asked, curious to see how Linda had handled Marcus's bullying tactics. I told him that all of our tenants are important to us, and that our policies exist to ensure fairness for everyone in the building. I also reminded him that his lease agreement clearly outlines the parking policies he agreed to when he signed it. Linda's tone was matter-of-fact, but I could detect a note of satisfaction in her voice. He hung up on me. Of course he had. Marcus hung up on people when he didn't get his way. He'd done it to me after abandoning me at the courthouse, and apparently he'd done it to Linda when she refused to bow to his demands for special treatment. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that," I said, feeling embarrassed by my son-in-law's behavior even though I'd had no control over it. "It's part of the job," Linda replied diplomatically. "Every property manager has to deal with difficult tenants occasionally. Most people are reasonable when you explain the rules clearly." Most people, not Marcus, apparently. Marcus was the kind of person who believed rules were for other people, that his success and connections should exempt him from the ordinary constraints that governed everyone else's behavior. I left Linda's office with a thick folder of documents and a head full of possibilities I'd never imagined having to consider. The drive back to Millbrook gave me time to process what I'd learned and what it meant for my relationship with Emily and Marcus. For 4 years, they'd been living in my building, benefiting from my generosity, while Marcus gradually became more dismissive and cruel toward me. For 4 years, I'd subsidized their lifestyle, while Marcus told anyone who would listen that I was looking for handouts and government assistance I didn't deserve. The knowledge sat in my chest like a lead weight, heavy with implications I wasn't sure I was ready to act upon. This wasn't just about money or property rights. This was about power dynamics that had been invisible to everyone, including me, until Robert's death forced me to take control of business decisions I'd never had to make before. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with the property management files spread across the table like battle plans. Emily's monthly rent payment was due in 3 days, just like it had been for the past 4 years. In 3 days, Marcus would write a check for about $200 and hand it to a management company, never knowing that the money would ultimately find its way into an account controlled by the mother-in-law he'd abandoned at a courthouse. The phone rang as I was reviewing the lease renewal timeline. Emily's name appeared on the caller ID, and for a moment I considered not answering. Our last conversation had ended with her defending Marcus's behavior and dismissing my feelings, and I wasn't sure I had the emotional energy for another round of her husband's apologetics. "Hi, Mom," Emily said when I finally picked up. Her voice sounded tired, strained in a way that was unusual for her normally confident tone. "Hello, Emily," I replied carefully, bracing myself for whatever this conversation would bring. "I wanted to call and check on you. I know things have been difficult since Dad died, and I feel like we haven't been communicating very well lately." "We haven't been communicating very well." As if our problems were simply a matter of poor communication, rather than a fundamental shift in values and priorities that had driven a wedge between us. "I'm managing," I said, which was true enough. I was managing, just not in the ways Emily might expect. "That's good. I worry about you in that big house all by yourself. Have you given any more thought to what Marcus suggested about senior living communities? I know it seemed overwhelming before, but maybe now that your disability benefits are approved, it would be easier to consider your options." Your options. Emily was still pushing Marcus's agenda, still trying to solve the problem of my independence by relocating me to some institutional setting where I wouldn't be her responsibility anymore. The fact that she was framing it as concern for my welfare only made it more insulting. "I'm quite comfortable in my own home," I said firmly. "I have no intention of moving to a senior facility." "But Mom, be realistic. What if you fall again? What if you have a medical emergency and there's no one around to help? At least in a senior community, there would be staff available if something happened. What if? Emily had learned Marcus's strategy of manufacturing crises to justify the solutions he wanted to impose. The same man who had abandoned me at a courthouse was now supposedly concerned about my safety and well-being. Emily, I've lived in this house for over 40 years. I know every creaky floorboard and every loose step. I have neighbors who check on me, a medical alert system that your father insisted on installing, and home health aides who come twice a week. I'm not helpless, and I'm not a burden that needs to be managed. No one said you were a burden, Emily replied, but her tone suggested otherwise. We just want what's best for you. We. Emily continued to speak as if she and Marcus were a united front in their concern for my welfare, as if their motivations were purely altruistic, rather than driven by a desire to simplify their own lives by removing me from the equation. What would be best for me, I said slowly, is having a daughter who doesn't see her mother as a problem to be solved. Silence stretched between us, filled with all the things neither of us was willing to say directly. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice defensive and sharp. That's not fair, Mom. I've been dealing with a lot of stress at work, and Marcus has been putting in 18-hour days trying to close this major deal. We're both exhausted, and sometimes it feels like you're just adding to the pressure instead of understanding how hard things are for us right now. Adding to the pressure. My disability hearing, my need for transportation, my desire to remain in my own home were all adding pressure to their busy, successful lives. The fact that Marcus had made a commitment to drive me to the courthouse and then abandon me was somehow my fault for creating the need in the first place. I see, I said quietly. Well, I certainly wouldn't want to add any pressure to your lives. Mom, you know that's not what I meant. But it was exactly what she meant, and we both knew it. Emily had absorbed Marcus's worldview so completely that she now saw my needs through his lens, viewing my requests for help as unreasonable impositions rather than the ordinary challenges of aging that families are supposed to navigate together. Emily, can I ask you something? I said, shifting the conversation in a direction that might give me some insight into how much Marcus shared about his business dealings. Of course. How do you like your apartment? Are you happy with the building and the neighborhood? Oh, we love it, Emily said, her voice brightening for the first time in our conversation. The location is perfect for Marcus's work, and the apartment itself is really spacious and well-maintained. We've been so lucky to get such a great place at such a reasonable rent. Marcus says comparable units in the area are going for way more than what we're paying, Marcus says. Even when discussing their housing situation, Emily deferred to her husband's expertise rather than expressing her own opinions. But more importantly, Marcus clearly knew they were getting a deal on their rent. He just didn't know why. Have you ever met your landlord? I asked, curious about how much they knew about the ownership structure. No, it's all handled through a management company. Marcus tried to get in touch with the owner once when he had some concerns about the parking situation, but they have a policy about not dealing directly with tenants. It's a little frustrating, but overall, the management company is pretty responsive. A little frustrating. Marcus's failed attempt to leverage his way into special parking privileges had been merely frustrating rather than embarrassing. I wondered if Emily knew about his threats to use his connections to pressure the management company, or if he'd painted his unsuccessful bullying as a reasonable business inquiry. That's nice that you have good management, I said neutrally. It makes such a difference when you're renting. Definitely. Marcus says we'll probably buy a house in the next year or two once he closes some of these big deals he's working on. But for now, the apartment works really well for us. Marcus says they'd be buying a house soon. I wondered if Marcus's house-buying timeline would change when he discovered that his current rent was about to increase by $650 per month, or when he learned that his lease might not be renewed at all. I wondered how his financial calculations would shift when he realized that the generous landlord who had been subsidizing his lifestyle was the same elderly woman he'd dismissed as a burden. "That sounds like a good plan," I said, though I was already thinking about how different Marcus's plan might look when he understood the true cost of his housing. "I should probably let you go," Emily said, her voice returning to its earlier, strained tone. "Marcus will be home soon, and I want to have dinner ready." Of course she did. Emily, who had once been fiercely independent, now organized her schedule around her husband's convenience, making sure his meals were prepared and his needs were met while he worked 18-hour days on deals that were more important than family obligations. "Give my regards to Marcus," I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "I will. And, Mom, please think about what we discussed regarding your living situation. We really do want what's best for you." After Emily hung up, I sat in my kitchen, staring at the property management files, thinking about the strange twist of fate that had put me in this position. 4 years ago, when Marcus first applied to rent the apartment, Linda had called to verify his employment and income as part of the standard screening process. Robert had approved the application without knowing anything about Marcus's character, based solely on his financial qualifications and Emily's recommendation. If Robert had lived to see Marcus's true nature revealed, would he have made different decisions about the lease renewal? Would he have been willing to use our property ownership as leverage to demand better treatment for his wife? I'd never know, because Robert had always seen the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. But I wasn't Robert. I didn't have his infinite capacity for forgiveness or his belief that people would eventually do the right thing if given enough chances. Marcus had shown me exactly who he was, and Emily had chosen to enable his behavior rather than challenge it. They had both made their choices, and now I would make mine. Over the next several weeks, I found myself paying closer attention to details I'd previously ignored. When Emily mentioned Marcus's business deals, I listened for information about his financial situation. When she complained about their busy social schedule, I noted the expensive restaurants and events they attended with money they were saving by living in my building. When she talked about their future plans, I wondered how those plans would change when their housing costs increased by nearly 60%. The knowledge of my power over their situation was intoxicating in a way that made me uncomfortable. I'd never been a vengeful person, never enjoyed having advantage over others, but Marcus's cruelty had awakened something in me that felt almost predatory. Every time I remembered sitting alone in that courthouse lobby, every time I replayed his casual dismissal of my needs, I felt a surge of anger that demanded some kind of resolution. But I also felt the weight of my decision pressing down on me like a physical burden. This wasn't just about Marcus. Emily would suffer the consequences of any action I took, and despite her recent behavior, she was still my daughter. The little girl who used to bring me dandelions and finger paintings was now a grown woman making terrible choices, but she was still the child I'd raised and loved unconditionally. The moral complexity of the situation kept me awake at night, staring at the ceiling and trying to find a path forward that would satisfy both justice and mercy. How do you hold someone accountable for their cruelty without destroying the people you love in the process? How do you use power responsibly when that power comes from circumstances the other person doesn't even know exist? I decided to start with a test, a small experiment that would give me insight into Marcus's character without revealing my hand. If he could show genuine remorse for his behavior, if he could acknowledge the pain he'd caused and make amends, then perhaps there was hope for our relationship. If he couldn't, then I would know that stronger measures were necessary. The opportunity came 3 weeks later when Emily called to tell me that Marcus had been promoted to senior partner at his real estate development firm. The promotion came with a significant raise in a corner office, and Emily's voice bubbled with excitement as she described the celebration dinner they'd had at some trendy downtown restaurant. "I'm so proud of him," she gushed. "He's worked so hard for this, and he really deserves the recognition." The company is giving him lead responsibility for their biggest project next year, some huge mixed-use development that could really establish his reputation in the industry. Marcus's career success was undoubtedly genuine, and I could understand Emily's pride in her husband's achievements. But the timing of his promotion, coming just weeks after he'd abandoned me at the courthouse, felt like salt in the wounds he'd inflicted. While I'd been sitting alone and abandoned, Marcus had been impressing his bosses with the same ruthless prioritization of business over human decency that had left me stranded. "That's wonderful," I said, injecting warmth into my voice. "You should both be very proud. I'd love to take you to dinner to celebrate when you have time." "Really? That's so sweet of you, Mom. I know Marcus would appreciate the gesture." "Would he?" I doubted that Marcus would appreciate anything from me, but I was curious to see how he'd respond to an offer of generosity from the woman he'd treated so poorly. "How about Saturday evening?" I suggested. "I could make reservations somewhere. Nice in Columbus, my treat." "Let me check with Marcus and get back to you," Emily said. "His schedule is pretty crazy right now, but I'm sure we can find a time that works." Let me check with Marcus. Even accepting a dinner invitation from her own mother required Marcus's approval, as if Emily weren't capable of making social decisions independently. The dynamic between them had become so skewed that I wondered if Emily even recognized how much of herself she'd surrendered to maintain their relationship. Emily called back the next day to confirm Saturday evening at 7 o'clock. She suggested an upscale steakhouse in downtown Columbus, the kind of place where entrees cost more than I spent on groceries in a week. I made reservations and spent the intervening days planning exactly what I wanted to say and how I wanted to approach the conversation. Saturday evening arrived gray and drizzly, with the kind of persistent rain that made my joints ache and my mood somber. I dressed carefully in a navy blue dress that Emily had given me for Christmas 2 years earlier, back when her gifts still reflected some knowledge of my preferences, rather than generic items selected by a personal shopper. I wanted to look respectable, dignified, like a woman whose feelings mattered and whose treatment deserved consideration. The restaurant was everything I'd expected from Emily's recommendation: dim lighting, leather banquettes, and prices that reflected the clientele's disposable income rather than the actual cost of the food. Marcus was already seated when I arrived, checking his phone with the same distracted intensity he'd shown during our drive to the courthouse. He looked up when the hostess led me to their table, his expression politely neutral in the way people reserve for social obligations they'd rather avoid. "Trish," he said, standing briefly to shake my hand as if I were a business associate rather than family. "Thanks for suggesting dinner. Emily tells me you wanted to celebrate my promotion." "Of course," I replied, settling into my chair with careful movements that accommodated my stiff joints. Success should be acknowledged, especially when it comes from hard work and dedication. Emily beamed at what she interpreted as praise for her husband, though I'd chosen my words carefully to avoid any hint of personal affection or approval. Marcus had worked hard for his promotion, but hard work didn't excuse cruel behavior or justify abandoning family members when they needed help. The first part of dinner proceeded with the kind of polite conversation that strangers might have at a wedding reception. Marcus talked about his new responsibilities at the firm. Emily described her latest marketing campaign, and I shared carefully edited updates about my health and daily routine. We were 3 people who shared a family connection but had nothing meaningful to say to each other, going through the motions of a celebration that felt more like a performance. It wasn't until dessert arrived that I decided to introduce the real purpose of our gathering. "Marcus," I said, setting down my coffee cup and looking directly at him. "I wanted to talk about what happened at the courthouse last month." His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a brief flicker of discomfort quickly replaced by defensive irritation. "What about it?" "I think we should clear the air about that situation. I know you had an important business meeting that day, but I was hurt by being left there for so long without any communication about the delay." Emily shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly hoping this conversation wouldn't escalate into an argument that would ruin their celebratory evening. But I wasn't planning to argue. I was planning to give Marcus an opportunity to show remorse, to acknowledge the impact of his actions, to demonstrate that he was capable of putting family relationships ahead of his ego. "Look, Trish," Marcus said, his tone suggesting that he considered this topic both boring and beneath his attention. "I explained all this to Emily already. Business emergencies happen. Important clients can't be kept waiting because someone needs a ride home. You're an adult. You figured it out." You figured it out. As if being abandoned at a courthouse were a puzzle to be solved rather than a betrayal of trust and basic human decency. As if my age and disability were irrelevant factors in a situation that required nothing more than resourcefulness on my part. "The issue isn't that I figured it out," I said calmly. "The issue is that you made a commitment to help me and then broke that commitment without considering how it would affect me." Marcus sighed in the exaggerated way people use when they think someone is being unreasonably dramatic. "I didn't break any commitment. I had a business emergency that took priority. That's how the real world works." The real world. According to Marcus, the real world was a place where business always trumped family, where elderly relatives were expendable conveniences, where keeping your word mattered less than advancing your career. It was a world where people like me were supposed to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention successful people like him were willing to provide. "I understand that business is important," I said, maintaining my calm tone despite the anger building in my chest. "But so are the commitments we make to family. When you offered to drive me to the courthouse, I relied on that offer. I arranged my day around it. And when you didn't show up, I was stranded in a place where I didn't know anyone, with no way to get home." "You called a taxi," Marcus replied dismissively. "Problem solved." "A stranger gave me a ride home," I corrected. "A courthouse security guard who took pity on an elderly woman who'd been abandoned by her own family. That got a reaction, though not the one I'd hoped for." Marcus's jaw tightened and his eyes flashed with irritation rather than shame. "Don't be dramatic," he said sharply. "You weren't abandoned. I got busy with work. It happens." Emily finally spoke up, her voice tentative and pleading. "Maybe we could just agree that it was an unfortunate miscommunication and move on? I hate seeing you two upset with each other." Miscommunication. Emily was still trying to minimize Marcus's behavior, still searching for ways to avoid holding her husband accountable for his actions. She wanted us to sweep this under the rug the same way she'd been sweeping Marcus's other cruelties under the rug for years. "I'm not upset," I said quietly. "I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed that when I needed help, the person who promised to provide it chose to prioritize a business meeting instead. And I'm disappointed that instead of acknowledging how that felt for me, you're dismissing my feelings as drama." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from irritation to something that looked almost like contempt. "You know what, Trish? I think this is really about you not being able to handle being on your own since Robert died. You're looking for someone to blame for feeling lonely and helpless, and I'm a convenient target." The words hit me like a physical blow. Marcus had taken my legitimate complaint about his behavior and twisted it into a psychological problem, suggesting that my grief and adjustment to widowhood had somehow distorted my perception of reality. He was gaslighting me, making me question my own experiences and emotions. "That's not what this is about," I said, my voice shakier than I wanted it to be. "Isn't it?" Marcus pressed on, apparently warming to his theme. "You call Emily constantly with problems that you could solve yourself if you tried. You expect special treatment because you're disabled, even though plenty of people with disabilities manage to be independent. And now you're creating drama over a simple scheduling conflict because you want attention. Creating drama, expecting special treatment, looking for attention." Marcus had transformed my reasonable request for basic consideration into a character flaw, painting me as a needy, manipulative woman who was using my disability and widowhood to make unreasonable demands on other people's time and energy. Emily looked mortified, her face flushed with embarrassment as other diners glanced toward our table. "Marcus, please keep your voice down," she whispered urgently. But Marcus was on a roll now, apparently seeing this as an opportunity to finally express all the irritation and resentment he'd been harboring toward me. The truth is, Trish, that some people rise to challenges, and some people let challenges define them. You've chosen to let your arthritis and Robert's death turn you into someone who needs constant help and sympathy. That's not anyone else's fault. Some people rise to challenges, as if my daily struggle with chronic pain were simply a matter of insufficient willpower, as if my grief over losing the love of my life were a character defect rather than a normal human response to loss. Marcus had reduced my entire existence to a failure of personal strength and determination. I looked at Emily, hoping to see some sign that she recognized how cruel her husband's words were, some indication that she would defend her mother against this character assassination. Instead, I saw a woman who was desperately uncomfortable, but unwilling to challenge the man she'd chosen to prioritize above all other relationships. "I think we should probably end this dinner," Emily said quietly, reaching for her purse. "We're not going to solve anything by getting upset with each other." Getting upset with each other. As if this were a mutual disagreement rather than Marcus systematically dismantling my character and dismissing my legitimate concerns. As if my hurt and anger were equivalent to his cruelty and contempt. "You're right," I said, standing slowly and gathering my composure around me like armor. "We're not going to solve anything here." I reached for my wallet to pay the check, but Marcus waved me away with a gesture that managed to be both generous and dismissive. "I've got it," he said. "Consider it an early birthday present." An early birthday present. The man who had just finished telling me that I was weak, needy, and attention-seeking was now paying for dinner, as if that generosity somehow canceled out his verbal assault. As if money could substitute for respect, kindness, or basic human decency. I left the restaurant that night knowing that my test had failed completely. Marcus had shown no remorse, no recognition of how his behavior had affected me, no willingness to consider that his actions might have been wrong. Instead, he doubled down on his cruelty, using my vulnerability as a weapon against me and my legitimate concerns as evidence of character flaws. The drive home to Millbrook gave me time to process what had happened and what it meant for my decision about their lease. Marcus had revealed himself completely that night, stripping away any pretense of family loyalty or basic human decency. He saw me as a burden, an obligation, someone whose needs were irrelevant compared to his important business dealings. But he'd also revealed something else, something that might prove useful in the months ahead. He'd shown me that he was supremely confident in his position, certain that his success and importance insulated him from consequences. He believed he could treat people however he wanted because he had power, and they didn't. Marcus had no idea how quickly power dynamics could shift. He had no idea that the elderly woman he'd just humiliated was the same person who controlled his housing situation. He had no idea that his comfortable life, his below-market rent, his convenient location were all dependent on the generosity of someone he'd just told was weak and attention-seeking. Most importantly, he had no idea that October 31st was approaching, and with it, the deadline for lease renewal decisions that would determine whether he continued to enjoy the lifestyle my investment made possible. As I pulled into my driveway on Maple Street, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. Marcus had chosen cruelty over kindness, dismissal over acknowledgement, contempt over basic human decency. He'd had multiple opportunities to show remorse, to make amends, to demonstrate that he was capable of treating family members with respect. He'd failed every test, and now it was time for him to face the consequences of those failures. The next morning, I called Linda Martinez, and scheduled another meeting. Linda Martinez listened without interruption as I recounted the dinner conversation with Marcus, her expression growing more serious with each detail I shared. When I finished describing his verbal assault and Emily's failure to defend me, she leaned back in her chair and shook her head slowly. "Mrs. Clark, I have to say that explains a lot about Mr. Fitzgerald's behavior when he contacted our office. He clearly feels entitled to special treatment and doesn't handle being told no very well." Linda pulled out a fresh legal pad and uncapped her pen. "Now, what exactly would you like to do about their lease situation?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with possibilities that ranged from minor adjustments to life-altering consequences. I had spent the entire night thinking about my options, weighing the satisfaction of immediate action against the long-term implications for my relationship with Emily. But Marcus's cruelty at dinner had crystallized something inside me, hardening my resolve in a way that surprised even me. "I want them out," I said quietly, the words carrying more weight than I'd expected. "I don't want to renew their lease when it expires in December." Linda nodded, making notes on her pad. "That's well within your rights as the property owner. We'll need to send them a notice of non-renewal by October 31st, which gives us about 6 weeks to prepare the documentation." 6 weeks. In 6 weeks, Marcus would receive a letter that would upend his comfortable world, forcing him to confront the reality that actions have consequences even for successful people who think they're untouchable. In 6 weeks, the elderly woman he'd dismissed as weak and attention-seeking would demonstrate exactly how much power she actually wielded. "What happens after we send the notice?" I asked, curious about the logistics of dismantling someone's life with a piece of registered mail. "They'll have until December 31st to vacate the premises, since they've been good tenants from a payment and maintenance standpoint. We'll provide them with positive references for other rental applications. But they'll need to find new housing, and at current market rates, they'll be paying significantly more than what they've been paying here." Significantly more. I thought about Marcus's promotion celebration, his expensive suits, his confidence in his own importance. How would he react when he discovered that his housing costs were about to increase by nearly 60%? How would his financial planning change when he realized that the generous landlord who had been subsidizing his lifestyle was the same person he'd humiliated in a restaurant? "Actually," I said, reconsidering my approach, "I think I'd prefer to offer them a lease renewal at market rate. That gives them a choice while making it clear that the subsidy is over." Linda's expression brightened slightly. "That's a very fair approach. They get to stay if they're willing to pay market rate, and you get to stop subsidizing someone who doesn't appreciate your generosity." Fair. That was exactly what I wanted this to be. Not revenge, not cruelty, just fairness. Marcus would finally pay the true cost of his housing, and Emily would see exactly how much her father's generosity had been contributing to their lifestyle. "Let's prepare a lease renewal offer at market rate," I decided. "And Linda? I want the renewal letter to come from me personally, not just from the management company." The next few weeks passed in a strange state of suspended anticipation. Every time Emily called with updates about their lives, every casual mention of their apartment or their neighborhood, I found myself thinking about how different those conversations would be after October 31st. October 31st arrived with crisp autumn weather. At exactly 10:47 a.m., my phone rang with Linda's confirmation that the certified letter had been delivered. Marcus had signed for it personally, and somewhere in Columbus, he was about to discover that his comfortable world had been built on the generosity of the woman he'd treated with such contempt. The first response came at 2:15 that afternoon. Emily's panicked voicemail was unlike any communication I'd ever received from my daughter. "Mom, what the hell is going on? Marcus just got some letters saying you own our building and that our rent is being raised to $1,850 a month. This has to be some kind of mistake. Call me back immediately." When I called her back, Emily's voice was strained with disbelief. "There's obviously been some kind of error with this lease renewal letter. You need to call the management company and tell them to fix it. There's no error, Emily, I said quietly. Your father and I bought that building as an investment property years ago. You and Marcus have been paying below-market rent because Robert wanted to help family. The silence that followed was profound. When Emily finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. You've owned our building this whole time? For 4 years, since before you and Marcus moved in. But why didn't you tell us? Because your father thought it was better to keep family and business separate. He was probably right, but he's not here anymore to make these decisions. Emily's voice cracked with desperation. Mom, you can't do this to us. We can't afford an extra $650 a month. That's almost $8,000 a year. Emily, you've been saving $8,000 a year because of your father's generosity. Now you'll need to live within your actual means, like everyone else. But this will destroy our budget. We'll have to move, find somewhere cheaper. It'll completely disrupt our lives. Emily, let me ask you something. Do you remember what Marcus said to me at dinner 3 weeks ago? Her silence told me everything. She remembered every word of Marcus's verbal assault, but she'd chosen to pretend it hadn't happened. Mom, Marcus was stressed that night. He didn't mean those things. Emily, your husband abandoned me at a courthouse when I needed help, then told me I was weak and attention-seeking when I tried to discuss how that felt. Now, you want me to continue paying $8,000 a year to subsidize his lifestyle. Do you understand how that sounds? The conversation continued for 20 more minutes, with Emily cycling through bargaining, promises that Marcus would apologize, and emotional manipulation. But underneath all her arguments was the fundamental assumption that I should continue subsidizing their lifestyle regardless of how they treated me. Emily, I finally said, the lease renewal offer stands. You and Marcus can accept the market rate and stay, or you can find housing elsewhere. Those are your options. Mom, please. You're destroying our family over a misunderstanding. I'm not destroying anything, sweetheart. I'm just no longer willing to pay someone to treat me badly. The second phase of their response began. The next morning with a call from Marcus himself. His voice was tight with controlled anger. Trish, we need to talk. Emily says you claim to own our building, which frankly sounds like some kind of scam. I want to see proof of ownership. Marcus, if you'd like verification, you can request that information from the county recorder's office. It's all public. Record. This is insane. You've been secretly controlling our housing situation for 4 years? What kind of manipulative game have you been playing? Marcus, there was no game. Robert bought the building as an investment and offered you below-market rent because you were family. You've been benefiting from that arrangement for 4 years. We've been paying rent every month like responsible tenants. We don't owe you anything beyond what's in our lease agreement. You're absolutely right. And I don't owe you anything. Beyond property ownership law, which allows me to set rent at market rates, Marcus attempted various strategies over the course of our conversation. He minimized his behavior at dinner as being a little harsh due to work stress. He offered to acknowledge misunderstandings if I would reduce the rent increase. He even suggested splitting the difference at $1,500 per month. But when I remained firm, that market rate was $1,850 with no negotiation. His mask finally slipped completely. Fine. You want to play hardball? We'll find somewhere else to live. There are plenty of apartments in Columbus, and frankly, it'll be a relief not to deal with this kind of family drama anymore. That's certainly your choice, I said calmly. Linda can provide you with positive references. Don't think this is over, Trish. Emily is devastated by what you're doing to our family. He hung up without saying goodbye, leaving me with a strange sense of satisfaction. The conversation had confirmed everything I'd suspected about his character. Over the next week, Emily called 3 more times, each conversation more desperate than the last. She'd been researching rental markets and discovered that comparable apartments were indeed more expensive, often requiring significant upfront costs they apparently didn't have readily available. "Mom, I've been looking at apartments all week. And everything decent is even more expensive than what you're asking for," Emily said during what turned out to be our final conversation about the lease. "Some places want first month, last month, and 2 months security deposit. We're looking at $5,000 or $6,000 in moving costs." "I'm sorry it's been difficult," I said, and I meant it. "Mom, please reconsider. Marcus is willing to apologize. He's willing to make amends. Can't we work through this as a family?" "Emily, an apology that's motivated by financial necessity isn't really an apology. It's just another negotiation tactic." "That's not fair, Mom. Maybe this situation has helped Marcus understand how his behavior affected you." "Emily, if Marcus has truly learned from this experience, then he's gained something valuable. But that doesn't obligate me to continue providing below-market housing." "Mom, you're choosing money over family. You're letting pride destroy our relationship." "Emily, I'm not choosing money over family. I'm choosing self-respect over enabling. There's a difference." 2 days before the November 15th deadline, Linda called with their decision. "They're moving out," she said simply. "Mr. Fitzgerald came by this morning to sign the lease termination. Papers. They'll be vacated by December 31st. Marcus had chosen pride over practicality. Rather than accept market-rate housing, he was choosing to uproot his life and find more expensive housing elsewhere, all to avoid admitting he'd been wrong." "Did he say anything about their plans?" I asked. "He mentioned finding something in the suburbs, farther from his office but more affordable. He seemed particularly upset about the commute implications." As December approached, I wondered if I'd made the right choice. The satisfaction of holding Marcus accountable was real, but so was the sadness of watching my relationship with Emily deteriorate. She called less frequently, and our conversations were brief and stilted. But in quiet moments, I remembered Robert's voice telling me I deserved better treatment, remembered Bill Peterson's kindness at the courthouse, remembered Marcus's cruel words in that restaurant. I knew I'd made the only choice my self-respect would allow. December arrived with an unexpected twist. Emily called on a Wednesday evening, her voice different somehow, less defensive, more thoughtful. "Mom, I need to tell you something," she said without preamble. "Marcus and I have been having some serious conversations about everything that's happened." I braced myself for another round of negotiations or emotional manipulation. "I found some things," Emily continued, her voice shaking slightly. "Financial records that Marcus had hidden from me. Credit card statements, investment accounts I didn't know about. Mom, we could have afforded the rent increase easily. Marcus lied to me about our financial situation." My heart sank. Emily was discovering what I'd suspected, that Marcus's objections hadn't been about money at all, but about control and pride. He's been spending money on things I didn't know about, expensive dinners with clients that were actually personal entertainment, a sports car he's keeping at his office parking garage, investment accounts in his name only. Emily's voice was getting stronger, more angry. "Mom, he made me think we were struggling financially when we weren't. He made me choose between my marriage and my mother based on lies." "Emily, I'm so sorry," I said, genuinely heartbroken for my daughter. "No, Mom, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I believed him when he said you were being unreasonable. I'm sorry I didn't defend you when he said those horrible things at dinner. I'm sorry I let him convince me that family loyalty meant protecting him from the consequences of his own behavior." Tears were flowing freely now, and I found myself crying too. "I left him," Emily said quietly. "Yesterday, I packed my things and moved into a hotel. I've already contacted a divorce attorney." "Oh, sweetheart," I whispered, my heart breaking. For the pain she was going through. I keep thinking about what you said, about choosing self-respect over enabling. You were right, Mom. I've been enabling his behavior for years, making excuses for him, prioritizing his comfort over everything else, including my relationship with you. Emily, I never wanted your marriage to end. I know, but Mom, it wasn't really a marriage anymore. It was me serving as Marcus's personal assistant and public relations manager, while he treated everyone around him, including me, like we existed solely for his convenience. She paused, gathering her thoughts. The rent increase thing was just the final straw. When he started hiding money from me to avoid paying you market rate, when he was willing to destroy our relationship with you over his pride, I realized that this wasn't about financial hardship. This was about him needing to win, needing to be right, needing to never face consequences for his actions. Where are you staying? I asked, maternal concern overriding everything else. The Hampton Inn downtown for now. I'm looking for a small apartment, something I can afford on my own salary. It's scary, Mom, but it's also liberating. I forgot what it felt like to make decisions based on what I thought was right, instead of what Marcus would approve of. You can come home, I said immediately. Your room is still here. You can stay as long as you need to figure things out. Are you sure? After everything I've done, everything I said to defend him. Emily, you're my daughter. You made mistakes, but so have I. What matters is that you're seeing clearly now. There was a long pause before Emily spoke again, her voice small and vulnerable. Mom, I'm so ashamed of how I treated you. You were going through the hardest time of your life, losing Dad, dealing with your disability case, and instead of supporting you, I let Marcus convince me that you were the problem. You were being manipulated by someone you trusted. That's not your fault. But I should have seen it. I should have recognized that the way he talked about you, the way he dismissed your needs, wasn't normal. I should have remembered who you really are. The woman who raised me, who taught me to be kind and strong and independent. You're remembering now, I said softly. That's what matters. I want to come home, Mom. Not just to stay while I get back on my feet, but to really come home. To remember who I used to be before I let someone else define me. Then come home, sweetheart. Come home. Emily arrived on a snowy Saturday morning in mid-December, pulling into our driveway in her small Honda with 2 suitcases and a box of belongings that represented everything she'd chosen to take from her marriage. She looked thinner than I, remembered and older, but there was something in her eyes that I hadn't seen in years, a clarity and determination that reminded me of the young woman she'd been before Marcus. We spent the first few days just talking, really talking, for the first time in years. Emily told me about the gradual erosion of her independence, how Marcus had slowly convinced her that her opinions were less valuable than his, that her career was less important, that her family relationships were obstacles to their success as a couple. He never said it directly, she explained as we sat in the kitchen sharing tea and homemade cookies. It was always subtle. He'd suggest that your calls were interrupting important conversations. He'd imply that visiting Millbrook was a waste of weekend time that could be spent networking with his colleagues. He'd roll his eyes when I mentioned wanting to take art classes or volunteer somewhere, like my interests were childish hobbies. I listened without judgment, recognizing the patterns of emotional manipulation that had been invisible to me when I was only seeing the end results of Emily's behavior. The worst part, Emily continued, is that I started to believe him. I started to think that being a good wife meant making his priorities my priorities, his goals my goals. I thought love meant making myself smaller so he could feel bigger. That's not love, sweetheart. That's control. I know that now, but at the time it felt like growth, like maturity. Marcus was so confident, so successful, and I thought that if I could just learn to see things his way, we'd be happy. And were you? Happy? Emily considered the question carefully. I thought I was, or maybe I thought I should be. I had the successful husband, the nice apartment, the lifestyle that looked perfect from the outside. But I felt empty inside, like I was playing a role instead of living my life. Over the following weeks, as Emily began the process of divorce proceedings and job searching, I watched my daughter slowly come back to herself. She started painting again, something she hadn't done in years. She reconnected with old friends that Marcus had considered unsuitable for their social circle. She laughed more, spoke up more, made decisions based on her own preferences rather than someone else's approval. The divorce process revealed even more of Marcus's deceptions. In addition to the hidden assets Emily had discovered, his attorneys' demands for spousal support painted a picture of a man who believed he was entitled to financial support from the woman he'd controlled and diminished. Emily's lawyer, a sharp woman named Janet Morrison, was having none of it. His position is that your wife should pay him alimony because his standard of living has become accustomed to certain luxuries, Janet explained during one of their strategy meetings. He's arguing that your decision to leave the marriage has caused him financial hardship. Financial hardship? Emily laughed bitterly. He's been hiding money from me for years. He has investment accounts I didn't even know existed. Exactly. And that's going to work in our favor. Financial fraud during marriage is taken very seriously by family courts. Meanwhile, Marcus's life was unraveling in ways that would have been satisfying if they weren't so predictable. Linda called in January to update me on the Riverside Commons situation. Your former son-in-law has been calling our office repeatedly, she reported. He seems to think that since he and Emily are divorcing, he should be entitled to resume his lease at the old rate. That's not how property law works, I said, amused despite myself. That's exactly what I told him. He's also been leaving negative reviews online, claiming that R&T Property Management engages in discriminatory practices. Unfortunately for him, we have documentation of all his interactions with our staff, including his attempts to intimidate us into giving him special treatment. Marcus was discovering that burning bridges had consequences, that treating people badly came back to haunt you when you needed help. His attempts to damage my property management company's reputation were backfiring as other tenants came forward, with their own stories of his entitled behavior. But the most meaningful development came in February, when Emily received an unexpected phone call at work. She'd taken a job with a nonprofit organization that provided art therapy services to senior citizens, a career move that reflected her rediscovered values rather than Marcus's priorities. "Mom, you're not going to believe this," Emily said when she called me that evening, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Do you remember Bill Peterson, the courthouse security guard who drove you home that day?" Of course, I remembered Bill. His kindness had been a bright spot in one of the darkest days of my life. He called the nonprofit today. His sister-in-law heard about our art therapy program and recommended it for their senior center. When he heard my name and realized I was your daughter, he specifically requested that I be assigned to his facility. That's wonderful, sweetheart. Mom, he told me what really happened that day at the courthouse. He said you were the most graceful person he'd ever seen handle being abandoned by family. He said you never complained or spoke badly about Marcus, even though you were clearly hurt and embarrassed. I felt tears welling up at the memory of Bill's kindness, at the reminder that there were still good people in the world who helped others simply because it was the right thing to do. He said something else, Emily continued, her voice growing softer. He said that watching how you handled that situation made him proud to help you, that you reminded him of his own mother, and the way she'd taught him to treat people with dignity no matter how they treated you. Bill Peterson is a good man. He is. And Mom, he helped me understand something important. He said that real strength isn't about never needing help. It's about maintaining your dignity and kindness even when people fail you. He said you showed him what grace under pressure really looks like. That conversation stayed with me for days, not because of the praise, but because of what it represented. Bill Peterson had seen me at my most vulnerable and had chosen to help. Emily had found her way back to herself and had chosen to rebuild our relationship. Even in the midst of loss and betrayal and family breakdown, there had been kindness, growth, and redemption. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came a sense of new beginnings that felt appropriate for all the changes in our lives. Emily had found a small apartment in Millbrook, just a few blocks from my house, and had decided to stay in town permanently. Her work with the art therapy program was fulfilling in ways her corporate marketing job had never been, and she'd started dating a teacher from the high school who appreciated her intelligence and creativity rather than trying to diminish them. Marcus's situation had continued to deteriorate. The divorce settlement had not gone in his favor, particularly after the discovery of his hidden assets and his attempts to manipulate Emily financially. His employer had grown tired of his increasingly erratic behavior and his tendency to blame others for his failures. In May, Emily heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd been forced to take a position with a smaller firm at a significant reduction in salary. "I should feel bad for him," Emily said as we worked together in my garden one Saturday morning, planting the flowers that would bloom through the summer. "But honestly, I just feel relieved that I'm not having to manage his emotions and make excuses for his behavior anymore." "You don't owe him your sympathy," I said, carefully positioning a marigold seedling in the freshly turned soil. "Consequences aren't cruel when they're the natural result of someone's choices. I keep thinking about what you said about choosing self-respect over enabling. It's become like a mantra for me. Anytime I start to feel guilty about leaving him, I remind myself that staying would have meant continuing to enable his worst impulses. And look at what you've gained by choosing differently." Emily looked around at my garden, at the little house where she'd grown up, at the life she was rebuilding according to her own values. "I gained myself back," she said simply. The 1-year anniversary of my disability hearing arrived in June, and with it came a perspective I couldn't have imagined when I was sitting alone on that courthouse bench. So much had changed since that day when Marcus abandoned me, and I felt powerless and forgotten. I'd learned that I had more strength than I'd realized, more resources than I'd known, and more power than anyone had given me credit for. But more importantly, I'd learned that using that power wisely meant using it to protect my dignity rather than seeking revenge, to establish boundaries rather than punish others, to create consequences that taught lessons rather than simply inflicted pain. Marcus had learned that actions have consequences, that elderly women aren't necessarily powerless, and that kindness withdrawn can be more impactful than kindness given. Emily had learned that love shouldn't require diminishing yourself, that family loyalty goes both ways, and that it's never too late to choose self-respect over convenience. And I had learned that rock bottom can be a foundation if you're willing to build on it, that quiet strength is often more powerful than loud aggression, and that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is refusing to enable their worst behavior. On a warm evening in late June, Emily and I sat on the front porch swing that Robert had installed so many years ago, watching the neighborhood children play in their yards and feeling grateful for the peace that had come from making difficult, but necessary choices. My arthritis still hurt, my joints still ached in the mornings, and I still missed Robert every day. But I was no longer the woman who apologized for existing, who accepted cruelty as the price of family harmony, who believed that her needs mattered less than everyone else's comfort. "Mom," Emily said as the fireflies began to flicker in the Mai. Gathering dusk, "I want to thank you." "For what, sweetheart?" "For showing me that it's possible to be kind without being weak, that you can love family while still holding them accountable, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst impulses." "You figured that out on your own," I said, squeezing her hand. "I just stopped getting in your way." "No, you did more than that. You showed me what it looks like to choose dignity over convenience, self-respect over approval. You taught me that I don't have to set myself on fire to keep other people warm." As we sat there in comfortable silence, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. It had started with betrayal and abandonment, with cruelty disguised as honesty and manipulation masquerading as love. But it had ended with understanding, with reconnection, with the kind of authentic relationship that's only possible when both people choose truth over comfort. The Marcus who had abandoned me at that courthouse, who had verbally assaulted me in that restaurant, who had treated my kindness as weakness and my needs as inconvenience, was living with the consequences of those choices. Not because I had sought revenge, but because I had finally stopped protecting him from the natural results of his behavior. The Emily who had defended his cruelty, who had prioritized his comfort over her mother's dignity, who had lost herself in someone else's definition of success, had found her way back to the woman she was meant to be. Not because I had forced her to choose, but because I had finally shown her what healthy boundaries looked like. And the Patricia Clark who had once sat alone in a courthouse lobby, feeling powerless and forgotten, had discovered that true power isn't about controlling other people. It's about refusing to let other people control you. The story that had begun with my daughter's husband leaving me at the courthouse during my disability. Hearing had ended with all of us learning something valuable about consequences, about family, about the difference between kindness and enabling. Marcus had learned that he couldn't treat people badly without eventually facing the results of that treatment. Emily had learned that love shouldn't require her to make herself smaller, and I had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop accepting unacceptable behavior. As the last light faded from the sky and Emily headed home to her own apartment, I sat alone on the porch swing and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete peace with my choices. The house was quiet. The neighborhood was settling into evening routines. And somewhere in Columbus, Marcus was living in a smaller apartment with a longer commute, facing the daily reality of what his life looked like when it wasn't subsidized by the generosity of people he'd chosen to treat badly. I didn't feel vindictive about his circumstances. I didn't feel guilty about Emily's difficult year. I felt something much simpler and much more profound. I felt like myself again, the woman who had built a life with Robert, who had taught children to read and write, who had raised a daughter to be strong and independent, who had always believed that people should treat each other with basic kindness and respect. That woman had never really disappeared. She had just been buried under years of accepting less than she deserved, of making excuses for other people's behavior, of believing that keeping peace was more important than keeping dignity. But she was back now, and she was never again going to accept being treated as if her feelings didn't matter, her needs were inconvenient, or her existence was a burden to be managed. The courthouse bench where I had sat alone and abandoned was just a memory now. In its place was this porch swing, this peaceful evening, this hard-won understanding that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is to stop doing things for them that they should be doing for themselves. Marcus had finally learned to pay market rate for his housing, to face the consequences of his actions, to live without the safety net provided by people he'd taken for granted. Emily had learned to live according to her own values, to choose relationships that enhanced rather than diminished her, to remember that she was worthy of respect and kindness. And I had learned the most important lesson of all, that you teach people how to treat you by what you're willing to accept, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to stop accepting the unacceptable. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.